Marie Antoinette was born on the 2nd of November, 1755, in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the sprawling imperial residence that had housed generations of Habsburg rulers. She was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, though only the 10th to survive infancy, a fact that hints at the harsh realities of 18th century European dynastic life. Vienna, in the mid-1700s, was a city of formal grandeur, a place where daily life intertwined with political ambition, and every gesture of its inhabitants was, in some way, connected to the survival of dynastic power. Even a child born into privilege could never escape the careful scrutiny imposed by court life. Marie Antoinette, or Antonia Josepha Johanna, as she was baptized, arrived into a world meticulously structured around hierarchy and etiquette. From her earliest days, she was surrounded by the symbols of Habsburg authority: gilded furniture, towering candelabras, and the ever-present hum of palace staff and courtiers. Her daily existence was a blend of instruction and observation. While other children in Europe might play freely, Antoinette's world was filled with tutors, governesses, and ceremonial rituals. The young Archduchess learned Latin and French before she had even mastered her native German, a detail reflecting the Habsburgs' long-standing strategy of educating their heirs in the languages and manners of European diplomacy. Her education was rigorous, but it was also intensely practical. Music, dance, and drawing were considered not merely artistic pursuits, but essential skills for a future queen. Court musicians played daily, and she was expected to practice for hours, perfecting her performance both for personal refinement and to impress foreign dignitaries. Likewise, dancing was more than entertainment. The ability to move gracefully through court balls and public ceremonies was a political tool, allowing her to project poise and elegance, signaling the refinement of her upbringing and the strength of the Habsburg dynasty. Despite this structured environment, Antoinette's childhood was not devoid of affection. She formed particularly close bonds with her siblings, many of whom would later influence European politics themselves. Letters exchanged between her and her sister, Maria Carolina, reveal a mixture of innocence and precocious political observation. These letters, though brief, offer historians a glimpse of a child simultaneously curious about the world and acutely aware of her place within it. Her mother, Maria Theresa, was strict yet devoted, emphasizing discipline, but not entirely neglecting tenderness. However, her father, Emperor Francis I, was often preoccupied with matters of state and had limited direct contact with his children. This imbalance, warmth from one parent and distant oversight from another, helped shape Antoinette's temperament, instilling in her both independence and a desire for personal attention. The Hofburg Palace itself was more than a residence. It was an ecosystem, a microcosm of European aristocracy. Courtiers, advisors, and servants all operated within an intricate hierarchy, each performing their duties with precision. The young Marie Antoinette observed these patterns closely, though perhaps without fully understanding their complexity. Servants moved through hidden corridors, carrying messages or provisions, while tutors monitored every utterance and action of their charges. It was a life where even minor missteps could carry consequences, teaching her early on the importance of decorum and discretion. Vienna, meanwhile, was alive with cultural and political vibrancy. The city's streets were crowded with merchants, craftsmen, and beggars, each contributing to the complex tapestry of urban life. Markets thrived with goods from across the empire, from Hungarian wines to Italian silks, and the sounds of multiple languages echoed through narrow streets. Marie Antoinette's limited excursions beyond the palace walls were carefully controlled, but these glimpses of the broader world exposed her to the diversity of her future subjects and the challenges that a ruler would face in understanding the lives of ordinary people. The political landscape of her early years also shaped her future in subtle but important ways. Europe was a continent of shifting alliances, dynastic marriages, and frequent wars. The 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, broke out when she was barely a year old, engulfing her homeland in conflict and uncertainty. Though she was shielded from the immediate dangers of battle, the war influenced the conversations she overheard in the palace corridors, the correspondence exchanged between her parents, and the sense of urgency that infused her upbringing. She absorbed, even if indirectly, the idea that political decisions could have far-reaching consequences, a lesson she would later find herself confronting with both naivety and determination in France. Religion, too, was a constant presence. Catholicism pervaded every aspect of court life, from daily prayers to the elaborate ceremonies marking birthdays, baptisms, and state occasions. Marie Antoinette was expected to internalize religious doctrine and display devout observance, not only as a personal virtue, but as a public affirmation of the Habsburgs' legitimacy. This emphasis on piety would shape her sense of morality, her understanding of duty, and her role as a symbolic figure in the eyes of both the clergy and the populace. Perhaps most significantly, the young Archduchess was raised with the weight of expectation. As the future bride of the Dauphin of France, her actions, her speech, and her appearance were all matters of political calculation. Every lesson she received was aimed at producing a future queen capable of representing her family and her country on the most prominent European stage. She was taught that beauty was a form of currency, that charm could open doors, and that discretion could prevent scandal. Yet, she was also encouraged, in measured ways, to cultivate her own opinions and desires, a tension between personal agency and political duty that would define much of her life. In these early years, Marie Antoinette also developed a keen interest in personal comfort and aesthetic pleasure. Reports from her later life suggest that her fondness for luxurious fabrics, elaborate hairstyles, and beautifully decorated rooms was not purely superficial. It was rooted in the environment of her childhood. She grew accustomed to a life where material refinement signaled status, where even the smallest object, whether a porcelain figurine or a painted fan, carried symbolic weight. These lessons would later become points of criticism in France, yet they were natural extensions of the culture in which she had been raised. Still, despite all this preparation and structure, there were moments of unpredictability. Illness was a constant threat. Childhood diseases claimed the lives of many of her siblings and peers. The young Marie Antoinette herself faced bouts of measles and smallpox, illnesses that could be fatal or disfiguring. Her survival through these diseases contributed to her resilience, teaching her, in subtle ways, the precariousness of life, even within the gilded confines of royalty. By the time she approached adolescence, Marie Antoinette had developed a personality shaped equally by privilege, instruction, and constraint. She was lively and intelligent, often impatient with the rigidities of court etiquette, yet she was also observant, learning when to comply and when to assert herself subtly. These traits, cultivated in Vienna, would serve her well and sometimes poorly when she was transplanted to the foreign, more politically charged environment of Versailles. It is important to pause and consider the paradoxes in her upbringing: a life of extreme luxury intertwined with strict discipline, affection tempered by formality, and freedom curtailed by expectation. These paradoxes were not unique to Marie Antoinette, but they illuminate the forces that shape historical figures long before they step onto the stage of world events. How much of the woman who would later be called Madame Deficit, or the Austrian woman, was formed in these early years? And how much was the product of her experiences in France? Even as she played in the sunlit gardens of Vienna, or practiced her scales in the echoing halls of the Hofburg, the young Archduchess was unknowingly preparing for a life that would be observed, criticized, and remembered by the world. Every moment of instruction, every letter to a sister, every polite bow and careful curtsy was a thread in the tapestry of her eventual public identity. And yet, for all the meticulous shaping of her youth, there remained uncertainties, unpredictable forces that no tutor, governess, or parent could fully control. As you imagine Marie Antoinette in these early years, you may picture the interplay of innocence and duty, the small joys of a privileged child, and the constant shadow of expectation. The seeds of her later life, her fascination with beauty, her occasional defiance of protocol, and her understanding of social performance were already planted, growing quietly beneath the surface of daily routine. And one cannot help but wonder, when the young Archduchess left Vienna to marry the heir of France, how fully could she understand the magnitude of the life awaiting her? The question lingers, unresolved, like a shadow stretching over the sunlit gardens where she once played. By 1770, Marie Antoinette was 15 years old, standing on the threshold of a life far removed from the carefully structured environment of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. Her betrothal to Louis Auguste, Dauphin of France, had been arranged by her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, as part of a long-standing Habsburg strategy of cementing alliances through dynastic marriage. The union was intended to reinforce political ties between the Habsburg Empire and France, two powerful, sometimes rival European powers. Yet for the young Archduchess, this political calculus mattered little in her daily life. She was about to leave behind everything familiar: her home, her family, and the cultural rhythms of Vienna, for a foreign court that was both dazzling and treacherous. The journey to France itself was an elaborate and carefully orchestrated affair. Traveling in the 18th century, especially as a royal bride, required extraordinary planning. Her entourage included dozens of attendants, ladies-in-waiting, and chambermaids, as well as the necessary chests of personal belongings, gifts, and ceremonial clothing. The route from Vienna to Versailles took several weeks, moving slowly by carriage across rivers, forests, and towns. Every overnight stop was meticulously prepared in advance. Inns were often bypassed in favor of temporary courtly lodgings, so that the young Archduchess could travel in comfort and safety. Throughout the journey, Marie Antoinette was both a traveler and a diplomat in training. She observed the landscapes, the towns, and the people of Europe in a way that was unusual for someone of her age. Each passing village or city was a lesson in the diversity of her new continent. Her letters home reflected curiosity, but also the anxiety of separation. She wrote to her mother about the small comforts of her carriage, the boredom of the long roads, and the excitement of glimpsing new lands. Behind the scenic descriptions, however, lay the weight of expectation. Her role in a marriage that would define the future of two nations was already a constant presence, even if she could not yet fully grasp its magnitude. Upon arrival in France, Marie Antoinette was met with a mixture of curiosity, ceremony, and scrutiny. The French court at Versailles was a world apart from Vienna, governed by strict hierarchies and intricate etiquette. Even minor missteps could provoke gossip or disapproval. Louis XV, the reigning king and grandfather of her future husband, presided over a court where appearances were paramount. Public ceremonies, daily audiences, and courtly rituals dominated life, leaving little room for personal preference or spontaneous action. For a young girl raised in Vienna, Versailles could be overwhelming. The palace itself was enormous, a sprawling complex of gilded salons, manicured gardens, and echoing corridors. Servants moved silently behind every door, attending to the needs of courtiers and royals alike. Every meal, every bow, every word spoken in public was observed and evaluated, reinforcing a constant awareness that personal behavior carried political significance. Marie Antoinette had been taught the importance of decorum in Vienna, but Versailles operated on an even more intricate scale, with layers of protocol that could be bewildering to a newcomer. The young Archduchess quickly realized that her life would revolve around a delicate balance of visibility and discretion. She was to be seen at court, but never in a way that drew negative attention. She was to form alliances with the influential ladies of Versailles, yet never challenge the subtle hierarchies they enforced. She was instructed in the elaborate ceremonies of the French monarchy, from the levee, where the king's morning routine became a public spectacle, to the grand balls, where every gesture of grace was scrutinized. These lessons, though tedious and demanding, were central to her survival and eventual influence as queen. Her personal relationship with the Dauphin, Louis Auguste, was another source of complexity. Unlike the romanticized notions of marriage common in later storytelling, this union was primarily a political contract. Louis Auguste was 16, reserved, and intellectually serious, in contrast to Marie Antoinette's vivacious and, at times, impulsive personality. Their initial interactions were marked by formality and caution. The young couple was often chaperoned, and intimate conversations were limited. Letters exchanged between them reveal a combination of politeness, curiosity, and the slow development of mutual understanding. It would take years before affection and genuine partnership would begin to shape their marriage. And even then, it would be challenged by external pressures from family, court factions, and public opinion. Life at Versailles also introduced Marie Antoinette to the financial realities of the French monarchy. She was given a personal allowance, but managing her expenditures was complicated by the expectations of the court. Fashion, a realm in which she would later become both famous and infamous, was already a subtle form of diplomacy. Every gown, every accessory, every hairstyle sent a message not merely of taste, but of wealth, political alignment, and status. The young Archduchess was taught to understand this language, yet the pressures of meeting these expectations were relentless. Small miscalculations could attract gossip, overspending could provoke criticism, while underdressing could signal disrespect or disinterest. Despite the formality of her surroundings, Marie Antoinette found small pockets of personal freedom. She developed friendships with certain ladies in waiting and attendants, discovering confidantes with whom she could speak frankly about her experiences. She explored the gardens and lesser-used corridors of Versailles, occasionally finding quiet moments to reflect or enjoy simple pleasures. Music, drawing, and embroidery provided familiar comforts from her childhood in Vienna. These small acts of agency were vital, allowing her to retain a sense of self amid the relentless public scrutiny that characterized her new life. Yet Versailles was not only a place of ceremony and beauty, it was also a center of political intrigue. Courtiers maneuvered for influence, forming factions around the king, the dauphin, and even foreign powers. Gossip traveled rapidly through the palace, and missteps could be amplified into scandals. The young Marie Antoinette quickly learned that visibility was both a privilege and a danger. Every gesture, every word, every glance was potentially political. A lesson that would later shape her strategies for navigating the French court and her reputation in history. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, remained a guiding presence from afar. Letters between mother and daughter are revealing. They are filled with advice, both practical and moral, reflecting Maria Theresa's desire to prepare Marie Antoinette for the complex responsibilities ahead. The Empress emphasized patience, prudence, and the importance of cultivating influence subtly, rather than through overt assertion. She also reminded her daughter of the weight of her position. She was not merely a young woman entering a marriage. She was the living symbol of Habsburg diplomacy and the future of Franco-Austrian relations. As Marie Antoinette settled into Versailles, she also encountered early criticisms and misunderstandings. Her youth and foreign origin made her an object of suspicion among some courtiers, who viewed her manners, accent, or appearance as indicators of unsuitability. The tension between her personality and the expectations of the court would intensify in the years to come, contributing to the public image that would eventually define her life in France. Even in these early months, the seeds of later conflict were present. The challenge of reconciling her personal inclinations with the rigid structure of Versailles, the pressures of public perception, and the complexities of a politically arranged marriage were realities she could not ignore. Every choice she made, from her clothing to her social interactions, was laden with meaning, and every misstep had the potential to echo beyond her immediate surroundings. It is striking to consider how much of Marie Antoinette's adult life was shaped by these early experiences at Versailles. The lessons in etiquette, diplomacy, and self-presentation were necessary for survival, but could also feel stifling, breeding impatience and a desire for personal freedom. It was in this tension between the demands of public duty and the pursuit of personal fulfillment that much of her character, and later her legacy, would emerge. By the end of her first year at Versailles, Marie Antoinette had begun to adapt to her new life. She understood the rhythms of court, the importance of alliances, and the subtleties of French aristocratic culture. Yet, even as she mastered these outward behaviors, there remained an unresolved question. How would a young Austrian archduchess, raised in the disciplined halls of Vienna, navigate a court that prized both appearances and intrigue? Especially as the shadow of public opinion began to grow. By the early 1772s, Marie Antoinette had spent several years at Versailles, gradually transitioning from a timid, foreign bride to a young woman learning to navigate the complex web of courtly life. At first, her presence at court was met with curiosity, even skepticism. French courtiers were deeply conscious of hierarchy and the subtleties of behavior, and the arrival of a teenage Austrian archduchess stirred anxieties and intrigue. Her foreign accent, her Viennese manners, and her apparent naivety became fodder for gossip, which travelled rapidly through the gilded corridors of the palace. Yet within this environment, Marie Antoinette began to assert herself, discovering strategies to manage the pressures and expectations that defined her new world. One of her first challenges was her relationship with Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI. Though married at 15, the couple's personal connection developed slowly, constrained by the formality of court life and the expectations imposed by their families. Letters exchanged between the young couple reveal a gradual progression from polite curiosity to tentative companionship. Louis Auguste, reserved and conscientious, was initially distant, a reflection both of his personality and the awkwardness of teenage marriage under political duress. Marie Antoinette, by contrast, was vivacious and socially adept, qualities that allowed her to charm many courtiers and observers, but also sometimes drew criticism for appearing frivolous or overly concerned with fashion and display. Fashion, indeed, became one of her earliest arenas of influence. Marie Antoinette's sense of style, ornate dresses, elaborate hairstyles, and striking accessories, was more than personal preference. It was a subtle form of diplomacy. Clothing signaled alliances, taste, and understanding of courtly norms. Yet, it also attracted scrutiny. French society, already keen on scrutinizing women of the royal family, began to label her extravagant. The nickname Madame Deficit emerged years later, but its roots were in these early years, where the young queen's affinity for luxury, though culturally conditioned and personally natural, conflicted with public expectations of austerity and prudence. Her influence extended beyond fashion, however. Marie Antoinette's energy, charm, and willingness to form personal relationships allowed her to cultivate a small network of allies at court. Ladies-in-waiting, attendants, and sympathetic courtiers became confidantes and informal advisors, helping her navigate ceremonial expectations and political nuances. Within this network, she could assert minor preferences and cultivate a sense of personal agency in a court where autonomy was severely restricted. This small sphere of influence would expand over time, shaping both her role in Versailles and her eventual ability to impact French politics, even if indirectly. Yet life at Versailles was not solely about appearance and influence. It was also a crucible of observation. The young queen quickly learned that the palace's sprawling corridors and salons were stages for subtle power struggles. Courtiers maneuvered for the favor of the king, the dauphin, and, later, Marie Antoinette herself. Gossip could elevate or destroy reputations. Alliances were constantly shifting, and a misstep could have long-lasting consequences. In this environment, the queen developed an acute awareness of perception. How her actions, her words, and even her presence could influence not only immediate outcomes, but also public perception, which could ripple outward to the broader political landscape. The Queen's early years also brought lessons in financial oversight. While she initially received a generous allowance, the management of courtly expenses proved complex. Beyond the cost of clothing and personal adornments, Marie Antoinette was responsible for hosting events, maintaining apartments, and managing gifts for courtiers. Every financial decision was scrutinized, both within the palace and by observers in Paris. Misjudgments, whether real or exaggerated, would later fuel criticism and contribute to her infamous reputation as a spendthrift, demonstrating how ordinary challenges of wealth management could transform into political liability in the context of a monarchy under public scrutiny. Despite these pressures, Marie Antoinette sought spaces of autonomy. The Petit Trianon, a small palace on the Versailles grounds, offered a refuge from the formalities of the main court. Here, she could experiment with simpler, more personal routines, cultivating a sense of privacy rarely afforded to someone of her station. She decorated rooms to her taste, cultivated gardens, and entertained close friends in an environment where the rigid protocols of Versailles were relaxed. While these retreats would later become the subject of criticism, sometimes depicted as symbols of frivolity or detachment, they were crucial for her psychological well-being, providing a space to explore personal interests, develop taste, and manage the pressures of public life. Socially, the young queen faced the challenge of integrating into a court that was both alien and judgmental. While she formed friendships, she also encountered hostility from factions loyal to other interests, particularly those who resented her foreign origins or viewed her as a symbol of Habsburg influence. Navigating this landscape required diplomatic subtlety, patience, and a willingness to adapt. Every interaction, whether at a formal ball, a private dinner, or a garden stroll, carried potential consequences, and Marie Antoinette quickly became adept at reading cues, managing impressions, and leveraging alliances to maintain a degree of personal agency within the constraints of Versailles. Her role as queen in training also exposed her to broader political realities. While she had little direct authority in her early years at court, she observed the mechanisms of governance, the deliberations of ministers, the influence of financiers, and the delicate balance between royal prerogative and public expectation. These observations were instructive, offering insights into the pressures that would later confront her as queen. Yet at the time, much of this understanding was experiential rather than theoretical. She learned by watching, listening, and sometimes by witnessing the mistakes of others, absorbing lessons that would be both valuable and potentially dangerous in the future. Health, both personal and public, was a persistent concern. Disease remained a constant threat in Versailles, as it had in Vienna, and medical knowledge was rudimentary. Smallpox, scarlet fever, and other illnesses were common, and the court's attention to ritualized hygiene was as much symbolic as practical. Marie Antoinette's own health, carefully monitored by attendants and physicians, reflected both the privilege and vulnerability of her position. Survival was never guaranteed, and every illness, however minor, could have implications for public perception, dynastic stability, and personal authority. By the mid-1770s, Marie Antoinette had begun to emerge as a young woman whose presence could influence courtly culture, yet whose personal autonomy remained constrained by political and social expectations. Her charm, intelligence, and emerging social acumen allowed her to navigate a treacherous environment, while her desire for personal freedom and comfort motivated the creation of private retreats and selective social circles. She was learning, slowly but steadily, to balance public duty with personal preference, a balancing act that would define much of her life and legacy. And yet, even as she adapted, the seeds of future controversy were already present. The very qualities that allowed her to charm and influence the court, her beauty, her energy, her taste for luxury, also made her a target for scrutiny. Misinterpretations, exaggerations, and rumor would later transform these traits into symbols of excess, fueling criticism that often ignored the political and social realities of her life. How could a young queen, so carefully trained and so aware of the stakes, reconcile personal desire with public duty in a court and a country increasingly attentive to appearances and critical of perceived indulgence? In reflecting on Marie Antoinette's early years at Versailles, one sees the interplay of preparation and unpredictability, of influence and vulnerability. She was both shaped by her upbringing in Vienna and transformed by her experiences in France, negotiating the delicate balance of power, perception, and personality. These formative years established patterns of behavior, alliances, and self-conception that would echo throughout her reign and beyond. And so, As Marie Antoinette walked the marble halls of Versailles, learning when to bow, when to smile, and when to retreat, she carried with her both the lessons of her childhood and the uncertainties of her future. Would her charm be enough to navigate a court rife with factionalism? Could her personal judgment survive the relentless gaze of public opinion? And as the young queen grew into her role, how would the choices she made, small gestures, social interactions, and personal preferences shape not only her own life, but the destiny of an entire monarchy? The answers to these questions would unfold slowly, with consequences that extended far beyond the gilded walls of Versailles. Marie Antoinette's marriage to Louis Auguste, Dauphin of France, was far more than a personal union. It was a carefully orchestrated political alliance. By the late 1762, the Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties sought to secure peace and strengthen ties between two of Europe's most powerful houses. This marriage, arranged by her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, and sanctioned by the French king, Louis XV, was designed to consolidate influence, secure diplomatic leverage, and ensure the continuation of both royal lines. For Marie Antoinette, then 15, the contract represented both a monumental opportunity and an immense responsibility. Although in her youth, the magnitude of her role was only partially grasped. Before leaving Vienna, the marriage contract had been meticulously negotiated. Beyond the political considerations, it included financial stipulations, ceremonial obligations, and clauses regarding the education and upbringing of potential heirs. These agreements were typical of dynastic unions, reflecting the broader European understanding that marriage was a tool of statecraft. Yet for Marie Antoinette, these formalities were abstract. She was primarily concerned with leaving home, traveling to a foreign land, and adapting to a culture whose language, customs, and expectations were often unfamiliar. Her departure from Vienna was marked by ceremonial displays and farewells befitting a Habsburg archduchess. Empress Maria Theresa, emphasizing both duty and propriety, instructed her daughter on behavior, attire, and the subtleties of French courtly life. The young bride was reminded that every gesture would be scrutinized. Her conduct could strengthen alliances, offend influential courtiers, or, inadvertently, diminish the prestige of the Habsburg dynasty. Even before crossing the border, she was being trained to embody not merely a young woman, but a symbol of diplomacy and dynastic strategy. The journey to France was long and carefully arranged. Carriages, attendants, and ceremonial accoutrements accompanied her, and her every move was planned to demonstrate Habsburg grandeur. When the party crossed into French territory, local officials and courtiers staged formal receptions, presenting gifts, arranging ceremonial escorts, and ensuring that the young bride's first impression of her new country was one of splendor. The journey itself, though tedious in its hours and miles, was a kind of training in public presentation. The Archduchess learned to endure scrutiny, maintain composure, and navigate unfamiliar social landscapes with grace. Upon arrival in Paris, Marie Antoinette encountered a court markedly different from Vienna. Versailles was not only larger and more ornate, it was also more politically charged. Daily life was governed by etiquette, hierarchy, and ritual, each codified in manuals and observed with painstaking care. For a young woman raised in the disciplined but comparatively insulated environment of the Hofburg, this environment was at once mesmerizing and intimidating. Every curtsy, smile, and measured step carried meaning, and missteps, no matter how minor, could attract gossip or disapproval. Her marriage to the Dauphin, Louis Auguste, was initially formal and restrained. Louis, a 16-year-old reserved and dutiful young man, approached the union with a sense of obligation rather than passion. The early days of their cohabitation were marked by stiffness, the careful negotiation of personal space, and the gradual attempt to form familiarity. The couple's relationship was watched closely, both by their families and by the French court, with each interaction subject to interpretation, rumor, and critique. For Marie Antoinette, learning to navigate this scrutiny was as crucial as mastering the ceremonial demands of Versailles. The marriage was consummated under the supervision of court officials, a process that was treated as both personal and political. Such arrangements, though perhaps uncomfortable from a modern perspective, were standard for royal unions, where the production of heirs was a paramount concern. The couple's early intimacy, or lack thereof, would become a recurring theme in histories of Marie Antoinette's life, reflecting the interplay of youth, duty, and the artificial pressures imposed by the court. As dauphine, Marie Antoinette had an official household of her own. Though subordinate to the king and queen, she was assigned ladies-in-waiting, attendants, and officials who would serve as intermediaries between her and the broader court. These individuals not only assisted with daily routines, but also shaped her understanding of French customs, language, and political expectations. Through them, she began to learn the delicate balance between influence and subservience that would define her role in the years to come. One of the first challenges she faced was adapting to French language and cultural nuances. Though she had learned French in Vienna, spoken French at Versailles differed in accent, idiom, and social usage. The nuances of vocabulary, intonation, and etiquette were essential for effective communication, and missteps could mark her as foreign or unsophisticated. Beyond language, she had to adapt to French dining customs, entertainment styles, and ceremonial traditions that had evolved over generations of Bourbon rule. Mastery of these practices was not merely social, it was political, signaling competence, refinement, and respect for her new country. Her days as dauphine were regimented, beginning early with private devotions, followed by lessons, audiences, and attendance at public ceremonies. Music, dance, and art continued to play important roles, serving both as personal enrichment and as demonstrations of sophistication to the court. Yet, the routine was relentless. Even minor mistakes, an incorrect curtsy, a misused phrase, or a lapse in attire could ripple through Versailles society, affecting her reputation and influence. Marie Antoinette quickly learned that visibility was double-edged. It offered opportunity, but it also carried risk. Financial management became another early test. As dauphine, she was allocated a personal allowance, but the expectations of hosting, entertaining, and maintaining her apartments often exceeded her income. Fashion, which had been an element of charm in Vienna, now became a source of potential controversy. Gowns, jewels, and hairstyles were scrutinized not only for taste, but for their cost. Critics, both within the court and among the public, would later use these early expenditures to question her judgment, framing them as evidence of extravagance, even if they were largely within the norms of royal expectation. Marie Antoinette's early influence, however, was subtle. She learned to cultivate allies among ladies, in waiting and sympathetic courtiers, forming networks of trust that allowed her some autonomy. Through these relationships, she could navigate ceremonial demands more smoothly, understand courtly politics, and assert minor preferences. These early experiments in influence and diplomacy were crucial, providing a foundation for her later attempts to manage larger political and social challenges. At the same time, her foreign origins continued to provoke both curiosity and suspicion. Courtiers sometimes doubted her loyalty or her understanding of French ways, interpreting unfamiliar behaviors as signs of ignorance or arrogance. Rumors circulated, often amplified by factional rivalries, reflecting the precarious position of a young dauphine attempting to establish herself in a politically charged environment. Learning to navigate these perceptions was an ongoing challenge, requiring diplomacy, discretion, and occasionally the careful use of charm. The early years of marriage also introduced Marie Antoinette to the weight of public expectation. Though young, she was acutely aware of her symbolic role. The Dauphine of France, future queen, and representative of both her natal and marital dynasties. Every gesture, from her posture at a ball to her conduct in private, carried significance. Success or failure in these small acts could have consequences not only for her personal reputation, but also for the perception of the monarchy itself. The realization that her life would be lived largely under observation was both empowering and burdensome, a duality that would characterize much of her reign. By the end of her first year as Dauphine, Marie Antoinette had begun to find her footing. She was learning to negotiate between personal inclination and public expectation, to form relationships that offered both comfort and political advantage, and to maintain composure under constant scrutiny. Yet, even as she adapted, the court of Versailles remained a complex, sometimes hostile environment, where influence was earned slowly, reputation was fragile, and misinterpretation was inevitable. And so, as the young dauphine walked the halls of Versailles, learning the subtleties of French etiquette, diplomacy, and social maneuvering, a quiet question lingered. How would a foreign teenager, thrust into the highest echelons of one of Europe's most scrutinizing courts, assert her individuality, form a lasting political presence, and prepare for the immense responsibilities that awaited her as queen? The answer, as history would reveal, would be shaped as much by circumstance as by her own choices, and the consequences would echo far beyond the gilded walls of Versailles. As the young dauphine settled into Versailles, the initial novelty of her arrival gradually gave way to the realities of daily court life. Versailles was a labyrinth of political maneuvering, ceremonial obligation, and social expectation. Every day brought new lessons in etiquette, diplomacy, and survival within the intricate hierarchy of the French monarchy. For Marie Antoinette, the challenge was not simply to perform the rituals of royalty, but to understand their meaning, anticipate their implications, and negotiate the subtle power dynamics that governed life at court. The first months were dominated by observation and adaptation. Each morning began with a formal ritual known as the lever, in which the king rose from bed and was attended by courtiers in a prescribed order of precedence. The dauphine was expected to observe, participate in minor roles, and learn the choreography of this highly structured environment. Though seemingly tedious, these rituals were politically significant. They reinforced hierarchies, signaled favor, and served as a stage on which power was performed daily. For Marie Antoinette, mastering the lever and its companion rituals required a combination of attentiveness, memory, and poise skills that she would refine over the coming years. Language presented an ongoing obstacle. While she had studied French in Vienna, the nuances of pronunciation, idiom, and tone at Versailles were distinct, and miscommunication could have social or political repercussions. Courtiers were quick to detect any foreignness, and even minor linguistic slips were noticed and sometimes ridiculed. To navigate this, Marie Antoinette immersed herself in conversation, reading, and careful observation. Over time, she began to speak with greater confidence and subtlety, gradually transforming what had initially marked her as an outsider into a tool for charm and diplomacy. Her personal household played a crucial role in this adaptation. Ladies-in-waiting, chambermaids, and attendants were not merely servants, they were intermediaries, cultural guides, and political informants. They helped the young dauphine understand the rhythms of Versailles, from the proper execution of a curtsy to the social subtleties of the king's court. Some were loyal, discreet, and attentive, while others had agendas of their own, seeking to influence her or curry favor with their allies. Navigating this internal ecosystem required both tact and judgment, lessons that Marie Antoinette learned gradually and sometimes painfully. Court fashion became both a point of influence and a source of controversy. The young dauphine's taste for elegant gowns, elaborate hairstyles, and luxurious fabrics was noted almost immediately. While these displays were standard among royalty, they attracted attention in France partly because Marie Antoinette's youth and vivacity made her stand out. She began to set trends, influencing court dress and social expectations, yet simultaneously drawing the scrutiny of those who viewed her style as excessive or inappropriate. Fashion was thus both a tool and a trap. It allowed her to demonstrate sophistication and taste, but it also made her an early target for criticism and rumor. Public perception was shaped not only by her visible lifestyle, but also by the intricate workings of Versailles society. Courtiers, diplomats, and members of the press, though far less influential than in modern times, circulated observations, often exaggerating or misrepresenting behaviors Some painted her as frivolous or naive, while others recognized her intelligence and charm. The young dauphine quickly realized that her reputation was a living, shifting construct, influenced by both her actions and the interpretations of others. This awareness would guide much of her behavior in the following years, as she sought to balance personal preference with public expectation. The Dauphine's relationship with Louis Auguste continued to develop slowly. Their early interactions were constrained by formal etiquette, age, and differing personalities. Louis was serious, cautious, and reserved, while Marie Antoinette was lively, socially adept, and occasionally impulsive. Over time, however, they began to understand each other, developing a cautious companionship built on shared observation and mutual adjustment. Their marriage, while arranged for political purposes, offered opportunities for personal growth, affection, and collaboration, though these opportunities were constantly tested by the pressures of public life and the scrutiny of court factions. Health and well-being were ongoing concerns. Versailles, while magnificent, was not immune to disease. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses were common, and even minor ailments could be dangerous in a pre-modern medical context. The Dauphine's physicians monitored her closely, but medical practice was rudimentary, and treatments often reflected contemporary theories more than effective cures. Nutrition, exercise, and hygiene were managed carefully, yet they were always secondary to ceremonial obligations and the expectations of visibility. The constant balancing of personal care and public duty became an early and persistent challenge for Marie Antoinette. Education, too, continued, though in modified form. While her initial years in Vienna had been filled with rigorous lessons in language, history, and music, life at Versailles shifted the focus toward practical application. She observed political debates, economic discussions, and court intrigue, learning the mechanics of governance and diplomacy by example. Cultural refinement remained important, and she engaged in music, drawing, and social games, both for personal enrichment and as demonstrations of taste and intelligence. These activities, though seemingly leisurely, were carefully scrutinized for their reflection of her character and suitability as future queen. Early controversies and misunderstandings began to emerge. Her foreign origins, youth, and occasional impetuosity made her vulnerable to misinterpretation. Courtiers and journalists, though limited in number, sometimes portrayed her as excessively indulgent, inattentive, or naive. While many of these critiques were unfair, they highlighted the fragility of reputation at Versailles and foreshadowed challenges that would intensify in later years. Even seemingly trivial actions, accepting a gift, selecting a dress, or participating in a social gathering, could be framed as evidence of impropriety or poor judgment. Amid these pressures, Marie Antoinette developed strategies to assert influence subtly. She cultivated allies among younger courtiers, attended social gatherings with discernment, and used private retreats like the Petit Trianon to manage her personal life away from prying eyes. These tactics allowed her to maintain a sense of agency within the rigid constraints of court, balancing personal preference with the expectations of visibility, decorum, and diplomacy. At the same time, she began to observe the broader political and social climate. France, in the early 1772s, was marked by financial strain, administrative complexity, and growing public scrutiny of the monarchy. Though her role as Dauphine limited direct involvement in governance, she witnessed the tension between royal privilege and public expectation, gaining insights that would later inform her understanding of the delicate relationship between monarchy and populace. These lessons, though indirect, were invaluable in shaping her later approach to both public life and crisis management. The young Dauphine also began to experience the first signs of loneliness and cultural displacement. Friends and family were far away in Vienna, and her social integration in France required continuous effort. Letters home provided comfort but also underscored the distance and the difference between her past life and present circumstances. The psychological burden of adjustment managing homesickness, expectations, and constant scrutiny was significant, and it fostered both resilience and a desire for personal refuge, qualities that would characterize her responses to later pressures. By the mid-1770s, Marie Antoinette had begun to carve a place for herself at Versailles. She was socially adept, increasingly confident in French customs, and able to navigate the subtle power structures of court. Yet, even as she gained influence, the challenges of visibility, public perception, and political sensitivity remained unresolved. The young dauphine faced a court that could be as supportive as it was critical, and a public that could exalt or condemn with equal intensity. Her integration into Versailles society revealed the delicate balance between appearance and reality, influence and vulnerability, and duty and desire. Every gesture mattered, every choice carried meaning, and every alliance had implications for her reputation and future. The lessons she learned during this period were subtle but profound, preparing her not only for the role of queen, but for the immense pressures of public life in a monarchy increasingly under scrutiny. And so, as Marie Antoinette moved through the glittering halls of Versailles, balancing social charm, personal desire, and political awareness, a quiet, persistent question emerged. Could a young foreign princess, trained in diplomacy and decorum, truly find a stable place in a court of intrigue and public expectation? And would her growing influence protect her or expose her to the mounting scrutiny that awaited? The answer, as history would reveal, remained uncertain, hovering at the edge of both opportunity and peril. By the late 1770s, Marie Antoinette was settling into her role as Dauphine of France with increasing confidence. Her early years of adaptation had paid off. She now navigated the intricate protocols of Versailles with poise, cultivated a modest circle of allies, and began exerting subtle influence over social and cultural matters. Yet, even as she gained confidence, the pressures of public expectation, court intrigue, and her own personal inclinations were converging to create circumstances that would define both her reputation and the future trajectory of her life. One of the most visible arenas of influence was fashion. Marie Antoinette's sense of style had matured from the early exuberance of a young Viennese princess into a deliberate form of social communication. She commissioned gowns that reflected both the refinement of French taste and her personal preferences, introduced new hairstyles, and selected jewelry in ways that signaled status, alliances, and subtle political cues. This was not mere vanity. In the highly visual culture of Versailles, appearance functioned as a language. Yet this same visibility also became a source of criticism. Courtiers, foreign observers, and eventually the Parisian public scrutinized her choices, interpreting the young Dauphine's style as extravagant or frivolous. The seeds of future scandal were already present, demonstrating how personal expression in a courtly context could easily be recast as political statement or misstatement. Beyond fashion, Marie Antoinette began to exert influence through social patronage and cultural engagement. She attended concerts, theatrical performances, and salons, cultivating relationships with artists, musicians, and intellectuals. These activities served multiple purposes. They reflected her personal taste, demonstrated her cultural sophistication, and allowed her to form alliances within Versailles that extended beyond mere courtly formality. These networks, though initially subtle, gave her both social capital and practical insight into the workings of French high society. In time, such engagements would enhance her ability to navigate the court, though they would also expose her to accusations of frivolity and detachment from political concerns. The Dauphine's relationship with Louis Auguste had evolved significantly by this point. Initially formal and cautious, it began to develop into a more personal partnership, though still constrained by youth, personality differences, and external pressures. Shared observation, mutual adaptation, and slow familiarity allowed them to communicate more effectively, forming a foundation of trust and companionship. Yet the pressures of expectation remained intense. Producing heirs, performing public duties, and representing dynastic alliances were ongoing imperatives. Louis Auguste's reserved nature often meant that Marie Antoinette bore the brunt of social engagement, further amplifying the visibility of her actions and decisions. financial management remained a persistent challenge. The Dauphine's allowance allowed her a degree of independence, but courtly demands, ceremonial obligations, and personal tastes often created tension between expenditure and expectation. Even seemingly minor choices, a lavish gown, an elaborate hairstyle, or hosting a small gathering, could be scrutinized as evidence of excess. Critics within the court and beyond would seize upon these expenditures, framing them as indicative of poor judgment or moral laxity. For Marie Antoinette, understanding this dynamic was crucial. She needed to navigate both the reality of her needs and the perception of propriety, a delicate balancing act that would define her public persona for years to come. Political awareness began to take root, though her role was largely observational rather than participatory. Marie Antoinette witnessed debates among ministers, negotiations between influential courtiers, and the subtle interplay of favor and disfavor that governed Versailles. She began to grasp the mechanics of influence, how alliances formed and shifted, how rumors circulated and magnified, and how personal conduct could carry political implications. These early observations shaped her understanding of power and its limitations, teaching her lessons about discretion, timing, and the sometimes capricious nature of fortune within a royal court. Yet even as she gained social and cultural influence, controversy began to follow her. Criticism, often exaggerated or unfair, focused on her foreign origins, her youth, and her perceived extravagance. Pamphlets, letters, and gossip circulated within Versailles and among Parisian elites, framing the Dauphine as indulgent, frivolous, or disconnected from the realities of France. These narratives, though not universally accepted, began to establish patterns of scrutiny that would intensify in later years. Marie Antoinette learned that visibility was inseparable from vulnerability, and that even minor missteps could be amplified into public perception. The young Dauphine also faced personal challenges: isolation from her family in Vienna, the rigors of courtly performance, and the constant observation by courtiers and subjects alike created emotional strain. While she developed close relationships with select allies, including friends among the ladies in waiting, the psychological weight of constant scrutiny required strategies of coping and retreat. Private spaces, such as the Petit Trianon, became essential for her mental and emotional well-being, offering a refuge from the relentless pressures of public life. Health remained a concern. The physical demands of court, long days of ceremonial attendance, social events, and rigorous routines, combined with the ever-present threat of disease, required vigilance. Marie Antoinette's physicians monitored her closely, and her careful attention to diet, rest, and hygiene reflected both personal concern and awareness of her symbolic role. Survival and presentation were intertwined. Her well-being affected both her private life and her public image. Despite these pressures, Marie Antoinette's early years as Dauphine demonstrated her capacity for resilience and adaptation. She learned to navigate the subtleties of courtly politics, manage public perception, and assert influence in culturally significant areas, such as fashion, arts, and patronage. These efforts allowed her to carve a space for personal agency within the rigid structures of Versailles. Yet, the interplay between visibility, expectation, and criticism was becoming more pronounced, hinting at the intense public scrutiny that would define her later years as queen. By the end of this period, Marie Antoinette's presence at Versailles was firmly established, though not yet fully secure. She had begun to assert influence, cultivate alliances, and understand the delicate balance between personal preference and public duty. At the same time, she faced the beginnings of a persistent narrative that would portray her as extravagant, foreign, and disconnected from France, an image that would grow over time, shaping her historical reputation. The early controversies and subtle power struggles of these years highlighted a fundamental tension that would define her life: the conflict between individual autonomy and public expectation, between personal desire and political obligation. Marie Antoinette's experiences as Dauphine were a microcosm of this challenge, a delicate negotiation that required intelligence, charm, and resilience. And so, as she walked through the halls of Versailles, balancing social maneuvering, personal taste, and public expectation, one question remained unresolved. Could a young queen in training navigate a court of intrigue, a society of observers, and a public increasingly attentive to appearances without sacrificing either her personal autonomy or her emerging influence? The answer, as history would show, would be neither simple nor immediate, setting the stage for both triumphs and tragedies that lay ahead. By the late 1772s, Versailles was not merely a royal residence, it was a sprawling, meticulously organized microcosm of French power and hierarchy. For anyone entering its gilded halls, particularly someone as young and foreign as Marie Antoinette, the palace could be both mesmerizing and bewildering. Life at Versailles was governed by strict rules of etiquette, elaborate schedules, and subtle power dynamics, all of which structured daily existence with precision. For a young royal, survival in this environment required careful observation, patience, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. The day at Versailles began before dawn. The lever, or rising of the king, was the first major ritual, attended by a carefully ordered series of courtiers, chamberlains, and royal family members. Though the dauphine's role was initially peripheral, she was expected to observe closely, learning the choreography of the court. This included when to bow, how to address various officials, and the sequence of entering and exiting chambers. The ritual of the lever was not mere ceremony. It was a stage on which power, rank, and favor were performed. Missing a step, literally or figuratively, could have consequences, sending signals about competence, respect, or perceived alignment within court factions. After the lever, the day continued with a mix of private and public obligations. Royals attended audiences, prayers, and official meetings, often in succession. Even seemingly trivial actions, such as the way a chair was positioned or how a curtsy was performed, could be interpreted as political signals. Each interaction required awareness of rank, precedence, and the nuances of French social etiquette. For a foreigner like Marie Antoinette, these lessons were crucial, as minor errors could be magnified by gossip or rumor. Meals at Versailles were also highly ritualized. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner were not simply times for nourishment, they were public displays of order, hierarchy, and decorum. Seating arrangements, the timing of service, and the correct use of utensils all carried symbolic weight. As dauphine, Marie Antoinette was expected to participate with precision, balancing personal comfort with public expectation. Observers were alert to missteps. Failing to follow protocol could be interpreted as ignorance, arrogance, or disrespect, regardless of intent. Social interactions at Versailles were governed by rigid hierarchies. Courtiers were acutely aware of rank, seniority, and favor, and every conversation, gesture, or glance carried potential significance. Alliances were constantly shifting, and subtle rivalries could influence everything from seating at a meal to attendance at social events. For a young woman in the royal household, mastering these subtleties was essential. Marie Antoinette quickly learned that influence depended not only on charm and intelligence, but also on a keen understanding of human behavior and the unspoken rules that structured the court. The palace itself was vast and intricate. Corridors stretched for hundreds of meters, lined with portraits, tapestries, and gilded ornamentation. Gardens, fountains, and hidden pathways provided spaces for private reflection, discreet conversation, and occasional leisure. For Marie Antoinette, these spaces offered both freedom and the opportunity to observe court dynamics from a distance. Even seemingly mundane activities, such as walking through the gardens or attending a rehearsal, could be opportunities for strategic observation, social positioning, or discreet diplomacy. Education continued alongside social duties. While earlier years in Vienna had emphasized formal academic lessons, life at Versailles shifted the focus toward practical application. Music, dance, and etiquette were central to social competence, while informal lessons in language, political observation, and cultural nuance allowed the dauphine to understand the subtleties of influence and power. Reading, letter writing, and intellectual conversation also played roles in refining her abilities to engage with peers, courtiers, and future political actors. Fashion remained a constant preoccupation. Clothing, hairstyles, and accessories were not merely personal expression but tools for signaling taste, status, and allegiance. Marie Antoinette quickly learned the impact of her sartorial choices on public perception. Even subtle deviations from expected norms, whether a slightly unconventional gown or an innovative hairstyle, could be interpreted as statements about personality, loyalty, or political inclination. Managing fashion became both a personal art and a political exercise. The dauphine also developed an awareness of ritualized privacy. Public spaces at Versailles offered constant scrutiny, yet private chambers, smaller salons, and the peripheral gardens allowed moments of personal agency. Within these retreats, she could rest, reflect, entertain close friends, and plan social strategy. The balance between visibility and seclusion became a key skill, allowing her to navigate the pressures of constant observation while maintaining psychological resilience. Health and personal care were intricately linked to visibility. Illness could be interpreted as weakness or neglect, while vitality and appearance were symbols of competence, decorum, and status. Physicians, attendants, and ladies-in-waiting monitored every aspect of the dauphine's condition, from diet to hygiene to exercise. Even the act of presenting oneself in a polished, controlled manner became a daily performance, reinforcing the connection between personal maintenance and public expectation. Entertainment and leisure were similarly structured. Balls, concerts, theatrical performances, and hunting excursions were not simply diversions. They were social stages where alliances were reinforced, reputations were formed, and influence could be exercised. Participation required both skill and strategic awareness. For Marie Antoinette, these events offered opportunities to charm, cultivate allies, and refine her social acumen, though they also increased visibility and the risk of criticism. Yet, for all the structure, life at Versailles could be monotonous. Repetition of ceremonies, constant observation, and the pressures of formality created an environment in which boredom, fatigue, and frustration were common. This monotony, however, was interspersed with moments of creativity, experimentation, and personal expression, particularly in areas like fashion, interior decoration, and cultural patronage. It was in these spaces that the dauphine could exercise personal agency while remaining within acceptable bounds of behavior. Navigating relationships at Versailles required acute awareness. Courtiers, attendants, and even family members were part of a network in which loyalty, ambition, and observation intertwined. Friendships were useful, alliances necessary, and caution essential. Marie Antoinette quickly learned that her own social skills could mitigate threats, foster support, and protect reputation, though she also recognized that missteps could have lasting consequences. Every interaction carried significance, and every decision, small or large, was part of a continuous negotiation of power and perception. By the end of her first years at court, the young dauphine had absorbed the rhythms of Versailles, the meticulous etiquette, the daily rituals, the strategic navigation of social networks, and the balancing of personal desire with public expectation. Her experience demonstrated the extent to which daily life in a royal court was both a performance and a training ground, preparing her for eventual responsibilities as queen. Yet, even with growing mastery, the pressures of visibility, scrutiny, and expectation remained constant. And so, as Marie Antoinette moved through the gilded corridors, balanced curtsies with conversation, and navigated the complex social web of Versailles, one unresolved thought lingered. Could mastery of these routines, however meticulous, truly prepare a young queen for the unpredictable pressures of political life, public opinion, and the eventual weight of a nation's gaze? The answer, as history would show, remained uncertain and fraught with challenge. Life at Versailles was not merely a sequence of daily rituals. It was an intricate social ecosystem in which every action, word, and gesture carried meaning. For Marie Antoinette, mastering court etiquette was a necessity, not an option. Versailles was both a palace and a stage, where appearance dictated influence, visibility demanded prudence, and social interactions required careful calculation. Even the most mundane actions, accepting a gift, choosing a seat, or speaking in a particular tone, were imbued with political, social, and symbolic significance. Understanding this environment was critical for survival, influence, and personal comfort. The Dauphine's education in etiquette began with the most obvious routines: curtsies, bows, and proper modes of address. Yet the real challenge lay in the subtleties. One had to know not only how to perform a gesture, but when it was appropriate, and how it would be perceived by different factions of the court. A curtsy that appeared natural to an outsider might be judged as stiff or insincere by a seasoned courtier. Speaking too quickly could suggest impertinence. Speaking too slowly could signal hesitation or weakness. Each action was scrutinized by courtiers attuned to the fine gradations of behavior, and missteps could ripple outward, affecting reputation and opportunity. Beyond the formalities, Marie Antoinette had to navigate the factional nature of Versailles society. Courtiers were aligned with specific interests, often revolving around proximity to the king, the dauphin, or influential ministers. Alliances shifted constantly, and gossip traveled rapidly, shaping perceptions before events had even occurred. The dauphine quickly learned that social interactions were never neutral. A compliment, a glance, or a shared joke could be interpreted as a signal of favor, opposition, or political intent. Understanding these undercurrents required keen observation, discretion, and memory skills that she cultivated over time. The formation of alliances was both strategic and delicate. Marie Antoinette needed friends who could support her socially and politically, but alliances also had risks. A courtier aligned too closely with one faction might be vulnerable if that faction fell out of favor. She carefully selected confidantes among ladies-in-waiting and sympathetic courtiers, cultivating loyalty and trust while avoiding overt displays of power that could provoke envy or suspicion. These relationships became a vital tool for negotiating the complexities of Versailles life, offering both practical support and social protection. Dining, though often viewed as a simple necessity, was another arena of strategic performance. The seating arrangements, the order in which guests were served, and even the choice of tableware carried symbolic weight. The Dauphine's conduct at these events reflected not only her personal refinement, but also her understanding of hierarchy and alliance. A misstep could be interpreted as arrogance, ignorance, or subtle defiance, while careful attention could reinforce her reputation as competent, cultured, and politically astute. Each meal was a microcosm of Versailles society, where observation, subtlety, and control were essential. Entertainment and public display were equally charged with significance. Balls, concerts, theatrical performances, and hunting expeditions were opportunities to demonstrate grace, taste, and social intelligence. They were also sites of scrutiny, where miscalculations could be magnified and reported to the broader court. Marie Antoinette quickly realized that participation required both skill and awareness. The ability to dance elegantly, choose appropriate conversation topics, and engage with the right people could enhance influence, while mistakes could undermine reputation. Social visibility was both privilege and risk, demanding constant attention. The Dauphine also confronted the pressure of public perception beyond the palace. Rumors and commentary circulated in Paris, reaching merchants, artisans, and even writers who observed and judged the behaviors of royalty. Critiques often amplified minor missteps, framing them as moral failings or signs of detachment from the realities of French life. Marie Antoinette's fashion choices, private entertainments, and associations were scrutinized with a level of intensity that few could escape. Understanding this public dimension became essential to managing both personal comfort and emerging influence. Private spaces, such as her apartments and the Petit Trianon, offered limited respite, but were themselves part of the social ecosystem. Retreats from public life allowed her to cultivate friendships, plan social engagements, and reflect on strategies for managing court pressures. Yet these spaces could also attract scrutiny if perceived as excessive or secretive. Balancing visibility and seclusion became a daily negotiation, requiring foresight, judgment, and adaptability. Education remained an ongoing concern. Though formal lessons had given way to practical observation, Marie Antoinette continued to refine her skills in language, etiquette, and cultural literacy. She observed ministerial discussions, diplomatic interactions, and court debates, gaining insight into governance and power. While she did not yet wield direct authority, these observations helped her understand how influence could be exercised indirectly and how reputation could amplify or undermine her effectiveness in both social and political spheres. The Dauphine's early years at Versailles were also marked by moments of isolation and vulnerability. Homesickness, cultural displacement, and the pressures of visibility created emotional strain. She learned that coping with the demands of court life required resilience, strategic retreat, and careful management of personal relationships. Letters to her mother and trusted confidantes reveal both her challenges and her growing ability to navigate these pressures, highlighting the human experience behind the ceremonial veneer of royalty. Even with mastery of etiquette and social nuance, Marie Antoinette faced ongoing risks. Misinterpretation, rumor, and factional rivalry were constant threats. Her foreign origins, youth, and occasional spontaneity made her an object of both fascination and suspicion. Navigating these risks required vigilance, patience, and the ability to learn from mistakes without overreacting, a delicate balance that would define much of her later life. By the mid-1770s, Marie Antoinette had begun to emerge as a figure capable of shaping her environment within the constraints of Versailles. She was socially skilled, attentive to hierarchy, and increasingly confident in her judgments. Yet, the social pressures of the palace were relentless. Every action carried significance, every interaction held potential consequences, and every alliance was provisional. The court was a place of perpetual negotiation, and success depended on both intellect and intuition. As she walked the corridors, attended audiences, and engaged in social rituals, Marie Antoinette's experience demonstrated the intricate relationship between visibility, influence, and vulnerability. Mastery of etiquette allowed her to navigate courtly life, but it could never fully shield her from criticism or misinterpretation. The balance between personal agency and public expectation remained delicate, and the social pressures of Versailles created a constant tension between performance and authenticity. And so, as the young Dauphine continued to move through the gilded halls, balancing ritual, diplomacy, and personal expression, one persistent question remained. Could mastery of etiquette and social strategy protect her from the unpredictable judgments of both court and public? Or would these very skills, so carefully honed, eventually contribute to the scrutiny and controversy that history would attach to her name? The answer, as future events would reveal, was far from straightforward and fraught with challenge. By the late 1770s, Marie Antoinette had become fully immersed in the rhythm and structure of life at Versailles. Yet her mastery of etiquette and social maneuvering did not guarantee smooth sailing. In many ways, it only intensified the scrutiny she faced. Every gesture, every appearance, and every association became fodder for both admiration and criticism, creating a constant tension between the young Dauphine's desire for personal expression and the relentless public and courtly gaze. The daily routines, which she had come to navigate with skill, now highlighted the complexity of court expectations. The lever, audience hours, meals, and entertainment events were no longer mere exercises in etiquette. They were stages on which reputation was continuously performed and judged. A misplaced gesture, a delayed response, or a perceived slight could quickly ripple through Versailles society, interpreted as either brilliance or impropriety. This environment required not only mastery of ritual, but also an almost constant awareness of perception reputation, and the politics of observation. Fashion, which had become one of her most visible forms of influence, increasingly drew scrutiny beyond the walls of Versailles. Marie Antoinette's taste for elaborate gowns, intricate hairstyles, and expensive jewelry was admired by some, but criticized by others, particularly those outside court who viewed such displays as evidence of extravagance or moral laxity. Pamphlets and letters circulated, sometimes exaggerating her choices into signs of decadence. The young dauphine learned that visibility could empower her socially, yet also expose her to rumor and hostility, an early lesson in the precarious balance of influence and risk. Social networks within the court were similarly complex. Alliances, once carefully cultivated, were subject to shifting loyalties, jealousy, and factional rivalry. Courtiers could praise or undermine her subtly, and friends might become rivals as circumstances evolved. Maintaining a delicate balance of trust, loyalty, and strategic engagement was critical. Through observation and trial, Marie Antoinette began to understand the mechanics of influence, how to cultivate favor, mitigate risk, and respond to slights with discretion. Yet even the most careful maneuvers could be misinterpreted, demonstrating the fragile nature of social positioning. At Versailles, public perception, increasingly shaped by observers in Paris, was another source of tension. Marie Antoinette's foreign origins, youth, and social vibrancy made her a subject of fascination, but also a target of criticism. Rumors portrayed her as frivolous, indulgent, and disconnected from French concerns. Some critiques were based on misrepresentation, others on genuine concern about royal excess. But all underscored the growing gap between personal reality and public narrative. The Dauphine's early experiences revealed that influence and scrutiny were inseparable. The more visible and active she became, the more vulnerable she was to misinterpretation. The Dauphine's personal life was similarly constrained. Privacy was limited, and retreats, such as the Petit Trianon, were among the few spaces where she could exercise personal agency without immediate observation. Within these spaces, she could entertain close friends, cultivate cultural pursuits, and momentarily escape the rigid demands of court. Yet even private actions were not entirely free from scrutiny, as courtiers and visitors often reported back to influential figures, creating a complex web of observation that reached beyond Versailles. The balance between seclusion and visibility became a constant negotiation, influencing both behavior and psychological resilience. Health, both physical and emotional, remained a persistent concern. The demands of public appearances, social events, and ceremonial obligations took a toll, and illness could affect not only personal well-being, but also public perception. Physicians, attendants, and ladies-in-waiting monitored her carefully, reflecting the high stakes of royal visibility. Mental resilience was equally important. Coping with homesickness, cultural displacement, and the relentless gaze of the court required strategies of adaptation and endurance. These early challenges fostered the Dauphine's growing understanding of her own limits, capacities, and the necessity of carefully managing both personal and public life. The young Dauphine also learned to navigate the political subtleties of social engagement. Observation of court factions, ministerial debates, and interactions with the king revealed how influence could be exercised indirectly. Even without formal authority, Marie Antoinette began to recognize how patronage, alliances, and subtle intervention could shift outcomes. These insights were invaluable, preparing her for eventual involvement in decision-making processes as she transitioned from Dauphine to Queen. Yet every action carried potential repercussions, demonstrating the delicate interplay between visibility, judgment, and influence in a court defined by hierarchy and scrutiny. As Marie Antoinette's presence at Versailles solidified, early controversies emerged. Critiques of her fashion choices, social gatherings, and foreign origins began to coalesce into persistent narratives that would follow her for years. While some criticism was mild or circumstantial, other accounts were more malicious, framing her behavior as evidence of excess, imprudence, or moral weakness. These early episodes highlighted the challenges of visibility. The skills that allowed her to navigate courtly life were simultaneously the tools that made her a target for scrutiny. Yet these challenges also fostered resilience. Marie Antoinette's ability to observe, adapt, and engage strategically allowed her to maintain influence despite public and courtly pressures. She learned the necessity of selective engagement, the value of trusted allies, and the importance of managing both perception and action. These lessons would become critical in the years ahead, as the pressures of monarchy intensified and the consequences of public perception became increasingly significant. By the end of her early years at Versailles, the dauphine had developed a nuanced understanding of the court as both a stage and a battleground. Mastery of etiquette, strategic social alliances, and subtle cultural influence were essential tools for survival. Yet these same tools carried inherent risks, as visibility and influence made her susceptible to rumor, misinterpretation, and political attack. The interplay of social skill and public scrutiny defined her experience, revealing both opportunities and vulnerabilities that would shape her later life as queen. And so, as Marie Antoinette navigated the gilded halls, choreographed her movements through ceremonies, and engaged in the delicate social maneuvers that defined Versailles, one final question emerged. Could the young queen in training maintain both her personal agency and her public reputation in a world where every action was interpreted, every gesture scrutinized, and every choice magnified by a society ever eager to judge? The answer would unfold slowly, shaped by circumstance, strategy, and the relentless pressures of a court that demanded perfection while offering no forgiveness for error. The Petit Trianon, a modest yet elegant chateau on the grounds of Versailles, represented a sharp contrast to the overwhelming grandeur of the main palace. Constructed during the reign of Louis XV and designed by Anne-Jacques Gabriel, it was intended as a private retreat, a space removed from the rigid ceremonies and hierarchical pressures of Versailles itself. For Marie Antoinette, who had spent years navigating the elaborate choreography of court life, the Petit Trianon would come to symbolize both personal refuge and a subtle assertion of independence within the constraints of royal expectation. Initially, the Petit Trianon was a place of occasional visits rather than permanent residence. Marie Antoinette was still deeply enmeshed in the obligations of the court, attending daily ceremonies, formal audiences, and elaborate social events. The chateau, with its simpler lines and intimate scale, offered an appealing contrast. A space where she could temporarily escape the constant scrutiny of courtiers, the intricate web of etiquette, and the endless observations that shaped daily life at Versailles. Here, she could experiment with personal taste, entertain friends in smaller circles, and cultivate a sense of autonomy that was largely impossible within the main palace. The building itself, though smaller than the main palace, was architecturally significant. Its neoclassical design emphasized proportion, simplicity, and elegance, offering a deliberate counterpoint to the lavish Baroque decoration of Versailles. Interiors were refined yet restrained, emphasizing comfort, light, and artistic detail. Furniture, tapestries, and decorative objects were chosen for both aesthetic appeal and personal utility, reflecting the tastes of the period. This environment allowed the dauphine to experiment with personal style in a controlled setting, balancing sophistication with relative informality. Marie Antoinette's first visits to the Petit Trianon were guided by curiosity and the encouragement of close attendance. She began to explore the possibilities of leisure, culture, and informal social engagement that the space permitted. Unlike the main palace, where every gesture was monitored and interpreted, the Petit Trianon allowed for quieter reflection, personal creativity, and private conversation. It was here that she could engage in music, drawing, reading, and intimate gatherings with trusted friends, creating moments of personal expression that were otherwise restricted by court obligations. Gardens surrounding the Petit Trianon were equally significant. Designed in geometric French style, they included meticulously arranged flower beds, fountains, and shaded paths. Later, Marie Antoinette would favor more naturalistic, English-style gardens, but in her initial visits, the formal arrangement reflected the disciplined aesthetic of Versailles. The gardens were not only beautiful, they functioned as spaces for walking, private discussion, and observation of the palace grounds. The act of moving through these gardens, even for brief periods, allowed the dauphine to step away from ceremonial life and experience the sense of autonomy that would become central to her enjoyment of the Petit Trianon. The Petit Trianon also served a social function distinct from the main palace. Unlike Versailles, where large gatherings reinforced hierarchy and observed rank, the smaller scale of the chateau permitted intimate gatherings, allowing Marie Antoinette to cultivate friendships and social alliances more naturally. She could entertain a limited circle of confidantes, conduct informal lessons or discussions, and develop personal rituals that reflected her preferences rather than courtly prescription. These gatherings often included music, conversation, and games, reinforcing social bonds in a less formalized context. Importantly, the Petit Trianon allowed Marie Antoinette to cultivate a sense of personal identity beyond the role of dauphine. Within Versailles, every action was mediated by the expectations of court, family, and public perception. Here, she could exercise judgment in choosing decor, arranging gatherings, and experimenting with fashion and cultural interests. While still constrained by her status and the requirements of royalty, these choices were exercised with far greater freedom, allowing her to develop taste, authority, and confidence in ways not possible in the main palace. The building also symbolized a delicate negotiation between visibility and retreat. While she sought privacy, she could not entirely escape observation. Courtiers and attendants sometimes accompanied her, and the proximity to Versailles meant that her activities remained partially visible to the public eye. Balancing this semi-private existence with the expectations of her role required discretion, strategic engagement, and careful attention to perception, a lesson that would echo throughout her later life. Even her initial visits were marked by experiments in informality. She engaged in lighter clothing, less rigid manners, and activities that would have been inappropriate in the main palace, such as casual walks in the gardens or private musical performances. These small acts allowed her to explore autonomy while remaining under the protective framework of her status. The Petit Trianon, in this sense, was both a refuge and a training ground for negotiating personal freedom within the structures of monarchy. The dauphine also began to cultivate cultural projects within the chateau. She commissioned artworks, organized musical performances, and developed spaces for intellectual and artistic exploration. These activities, though modest compared to the scale of Versailles, provided a canvas for her growing influence and taste. They allowed her to demonstrate sophistication, creativity, and discernment qualities that would later define her public image in both positive and controversial ways. The contrast between Versailles and the Petit Trianon highlighted a tension central to Marie Antoinette's experience: the desire for personal autonomy versus the obligations of public visibility. At Versailles, mastery of etiquette and performance was essential for survival and influence. At the Petit Trianon, she could explore personal expression, cultivate friendships, and engage with culture on her own terms. Both spaces required skill, judgment, and adaptability, but the stakes and freedoms differed, shaping her understanding of power, identity, and strategy within the royal framework. These early visits also foreshadowed the central role the Petit Trianon would play in her life. As the years progressed, the chateau became more than a retreat. It became a symbol of her personal agency, her taste, and, eventually, the focus of criticism from those who perceived her autonomy as a challenge to traditional courtly expectations. Even in its earliest days, the Petit Trianon represented a microcosm of Marie Antoinette's emerging approach to balancing personal desire, social influence, and the pressures of monarchy. Yet questions lingered. Could this modest chateau, with its intimacy and privacy, truly provide a refuge from the relentless pressures of court life? Could the dauphine navigate the balance between retreat and visibility, between personal expression and political prudence, without exposing herself to criticism or misunderstanding? The Petit Trianon offered opportunity, but it also introduced subtle risks, shaping a space that was both sanctuary and stage. As Marie Antoinette grew more familiar with the Petit Trianon, her visits evolved from occasional escapes into deliberate exercises in autonomy. Unlike the rigid structures of Versailles, where every gesture was scrutinized and every word interpreted, the chateau offered freedom of movement, choice, and expression. Here, she could develop routines, cultivate friendships, and explore personal tastes in ways that were impossible within the formal court. Yet even these freedoms were bounded by her status, proximity to Versailles, and the ever-present awareness that visibility, even subtle visibility, carried consequences. The Dauphine's private routines at the Petit Trianon reflected both leisure and strategy. Mornings might begin with walks in the gardens, a practice that combined health, observation, and social engagement. Unlike Versailles, where public promenades were carefully choreographed, these walks allowed for informal conversation with trusted attendants or friends. Paths through shaded groves and along flowered avenues became spaces for reflection, planning, and discreet social maneuvering. Even the act of walking, seemingly mundane, was intertwined with considerations of etiquette, visibility, and the cultivation of taste. Fashion, again, played a central role. In the privacy of the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette could experiment with lighter gowns, simpler fabrics, and styles that reflected personal preference rather than public expectation. She began to explore forms of dress that later drew both admiration and criticism, blending elegance with a perceived informality. These choices reflected a nuanced understanding of visibility. She could express individuality in a controlled environment while carefully managing the risk of broader observation. The Petit Trianon became a laboratory for cultivating personal style, an extension of her emerging authority within the courtly hierarchy. Cultural engagement was another dimension of her personalization. Marie Antoinette developed small salons, musical performances, and reading sessions that emphasized intimacy, intellectual curiosity, and artistic taste. She invited select companions, ladies-in-waiting, artists, and musicians, creating a microcosm of social and cultural life, separate from the spectacle of Versailles. These activities allowed her to cultivate influence, build loyalty, and demonstrate discernment in ways that were subtle yet significant. Within these walls, she could shape her environment, assert taste, and practice authority on a scale both manageable and meaningful. Gardening became a particularly notable activity. While Versailles' gardens were formal and highly structured, Marie Antoinette favored a more naturalistic English-style landscape for parts of the Petit Trianon grounds. Winding paths, small groves, and informal flower beds reflected personal preference, offering both aesthetic pleasure and symbolic assertion. Gardening allowed her to shape the physical space, exercise creativity, and engage in a form of labor that was socially acceptable yet removed from the rigid spectacle of court life. The garden became a site of refuge, a canvas for personal expression, and a subtle statement of taste and autonomy. Entertainment within the Petit Trianon followed the same principles. While Versailles required performances to reflect hierarchy and audience expectation, the chateau allowed for informal games, musical experimentation, and intimate dinners. These gatherings reinforced personal bonds and allowed the dauphine to exercise influence discreetly. Social skill remained essential. Even in private, interactions shaped loyalty, perception, and reputation. Each gathering was a balancing act pleasure combined with strategic attention to alliances and proprieties, a microcosm of her broader experience in courtly life. Yet the use of the Petit Trianon also created tension with the main court. The very freedom and informality that provided personal refuge were perceived by some courtiers as subversive or inappropriate. Retreats from Versailles could be interpreted as avoidance of duty, indulgence, or even frivolity. Critics began to frame the Dauphine's private pursuits as evidence of detachment from the responsibilities of monarchy. The delicate balance between autonomy and perception became increasingly visible. The spaces and routines that allowed Marie Antoinette to cultivate identity were also fertile ground for criticism and rumor. Health and well-being continued to influence her routines. The physical demands of court life remained, even in semi-private spaces, and Marie Antoinette was mindful of diet, exercise, and rest. Walks in the gardens, time for music and drawing, and the occasional private retreat contributed to both physical and mental resilience. In this sense, the Petit Trianon functioned as both sanctuary and training ground. It allowed the dauphine to strengthen capacities that were essential for surviving the pressures of Versailles, while also offering opportunities for personal growth and reflection. Education and observation remained central, even in private life. Discussions with artists, musicians, and confidantes allowed Marie Antoinette to refine taste, judgment, and social strategy. Reading, letter writing, and reflection became tools for understanding not only aesthetics, but also human behavior and influence. The Petit Trianon, in effect, became a laboratory for social and cultural learning, where personal experimentation could inform broader strategies within court life. Relationships forged within the chateau were vital. Close friends, trusted attendants, and selected courtiers formed a network of support, loyalty, and counsel. These connections provided emotional sustenance, social guidance, and occasional protection against the pressures and intrigues of Versailles. Private alliances were distinct from public ones. Here, loyalty was based on trust, shared interest, and discretion, rather than visibility, offering a more stable foundation than the shifting dynamics of the main court. Even as the Petit Trianon became a center of autonomy, Marie Antoinette understood that public perception could never be fully escaped. Courtiers, observers, and later historians would interpret her retreats as indulgence, detachment, or even moral failure. The balance between seclusion and visibility remained delicate, highlighting the inherent tension in attempting to craft a personal space within the structures of monarchy. Each decision, where to walk, who to invite, how to dress, carried potential consequences, illustrating that autonomy within royalty was always negotiated rather than absolute. By the mid-1770s, Marie Antoinette had transformed the Petit Trianon from a simple retreat into a site of personal authority, cultural expression, and social experimentation. The chateau allowed her to navigate the fine line between freedom and duty, personal taste and public expectation, intimacy and observation. It became a symbol of her growing confidence, her evolving taste, and the subtle assertion of agency within a rigidly structured world. Yet, with freedom came vulnerability. The activities, style, and social choices she cultivated in these private spaces would later become focal points of public criticism and rumor. The very practices that allowed Marie Antoinette to flourish privately, personalized gardens, intimate social gatherings, innovative fashion, were reinterpreted as evidence of excess or detachment, highlighting the precarious nature of personal agency in a monarchy under constant observation. And so, as the dauphine moved through her private halls, wandered through shaded gardens, and hosted intimate gatherings, one unresolved question remained. Could Marie Antoinette maintain this delicate balance between personal freedom and public expectation? Or would the very space that nurtured her autonomy ultimately become a source of scrutiny and criticism that she could not fully control? The answer would slowly emerge, shaped by perception, politics, and the pressures of a court ever eager to judge. By the early 1780s, the Petit Trianon had become far more than a simple retreat for Marie Antoinette. It had evolved into a center of personal agency, cultural innovation, and social experimentation, a space where she could exercise taste, influence, and discretion in ways that Versailles itself rarely permitted. The chateau, modest in comparison to the sprawling palace, provided her with a domain in which she could shape both the environment and the social dynamics around her. Yet, as freedom increased, so did scrutiny, and the very qualities that made the Petit Trianon a sanctuary would eventually render it a symbol of perceived excess and criticism. Marie Antoinette began to customize the chateau and its grounds extensively. She commissioned redesigns of interior spaces, choosing furniture, tapestries, and decorative objects that reflected her tastes. The Petit Trianon's rooms were adapted for comfort and utility, balancing elegance with informality. Bedrooms, salons, and galleries were arranged to facilitate both private reflection and small gatherings. Each change was deliberate, designed to create spaces where personal expression could thrive, while still adhering to certain standards of propriety expected of a royal. The gardens became central to her vision. Moving beyond the formal French style she first encountered, she embraced English-style landscaping. Winding paths, informal flower arrangements, rustic follies, and small groves. These gardens reflected an aesthetic of natural beauty, personal taste, and creative freedom, emphasizing comfort and intimacy rather than strict ceremonial display. Walks through the gardens allowed for private conversation, reflection, and strategic social engagement, making the landscape both a physical and symbolic extension of Marie Antoinette's agency. Within the Petit Trianon, she curated a circle of close companions who could participate in the intimate and cultured atmosphere she was cultivating. These gatherings, often including music, theatre, reading, and conversation, fostered both loyalty and intellectual engagement. Unlike the sprawling audiences of Versailles, where hierarchy dictated interactions, the smaller scale allowed for genuine exchange, experimentation, and mutual influence. Here, Marie Antoinette exercised subtle authority, shaping not only the physical environment but also the social and cultural life of her immediate circle. Cultural projects became an important outlet for her influence. She commissioned artworks, encouraged musical performances, and supported artisans. In doing so, she shaped aesthetic standards, facilitated the careers of artists, and cultivated a refined environment that reinforced her taste and judgment. These endeavors were modest in scale compared to the grandeur of Versailles, yet they were highly significant in shaping her personal identity and public persona. The Petit Trianon became a laboratory for experimentation in style, culture, and social conduct, an extension of her role as both patron and participant in French elite life. However, her semi-private autonomy was not without social consequences. Courtiers and the public began to interpret her retreats and informal activities in negative terms. Critics framed her enjoyment of private gardens, intimate gatherings, and cultural experiments as evidence of detachment from duty, indulgence, and extravagance. Pamphlets and letters circulated, exaggerating or misrepresenting her personal choices. What she considered personal expression and carefully managed social engagement was recast as frivolity, moral laxity, or political irrelevance. The Petit Trianon, intended as a haven, began to acquire symbolic weight in public perception, a space that marked both freedom and vulnerability. These early controversies demonstrated the fragile nature of personal agency within monarchy. Marie Antoinette had learned to navigate court etiquette, social alliances, and cultural influence with skill. Yet, even carefully considered behavior could be misunderstood. The more visible her choices became, even indirectly through gossip or rumor, the greater the scrutiny she faced. This tension between autonomy and judgment, personal expression, and public expectation would define much of her subsequent life and legacy. The Petit Trianon also highlighted her growing strategic understanding of influence. By controlling her private environment, she could cultivate taste, discretion, and loyalty in a controlled setting. Friendships, forged in these spaces, were more enduring and intimate than those in the broader court, providing her with both emotional support and political insight. Yet, the very act of creating a semi-autonomous domain was interpreted by some as a challenge to the ceremonial hierarchy of Versailles, signaling the delicate balancing act required to maintain both personal freedom and public propriety. Health, leisure, and self-reflection remained central to her routines. Walks, musical practice, reading, and small-scale entertainments provided necessary respite from court pressures while also enhancing social and cultural influence. These practices reinforced her resilience, allowed her to cultivate judgment and taste, and offered a measure of control in a life otherwise governed by expectation and observation. The Petit Trianon thus became a space where survival, personal growth, and subtle influence intersected a rare combination in the highly visible and scrutinized world of royalty. By the mid-1780s, the chateau had achieved full significance in Marie Antoinette's life. It was both sanctuary and stage, offering privacy and control while remaining inseparable from public perception. Her choices in design, culture, and social practice reflected deliberate management of personal and symbolic power, revealing a sophisticated understanding of autonomy, influence, and reputation. Yet, as critics would note, freedom within monarchy was always provisional. Each act of personal expression carried risk, and every retreat from public expectation was subject to reinterpretation and judgment. The legacy of her early engagement with the Petit Trianon would endure. The space symbolized her capacity for personal autonomy, cultural cultivation, and strategic social engagement. Yet it also foreshadowed the controversies and criticisms that would increasingly define her public image. The balance between sanctuary and scrutiny, between experimentation and judgment, remained precarious, highlighting the complexity of life for a young queen seeking both personal fulfillment and social legitimacy. And so, as Marie Antoinette walked the shaded paths, hosted intimate gatherings, and curated cultural projects, one central question persisted. Could a young queen successfully navigate the tension between personal freedom and public expectation? Or would the very pursuit of autonomy within the Petit Trianon ultimately fuel criticism, suspicion, and controversy that no private retreat could fully contain? The answer would unfold slowly, shaping the trajectory of her reputation and the narrative of her life in ways both subtle and enduring. Marie Antoinette's marriage to Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, was not merely a union of two young individuals. It was a calculated political alliance designed to strengthen diplomatic ties between Austria and France. Arranged by powerful ministers and monarchs on both sides, the marriage was emblematic of the intricate web of dynastic diplomacy that characterized 18th century Europe. Yet, behind the political symbolism, the marriage also imposed intense personal and public expectations, shaping the early years of Marie Antoinette's life in ways both subtle and profound. The union, formalized in 1770, was preceded by careful preparation on both sides. Louis Auguste, a reserved and introspective young man, had been trained meticulously in the protocols, etiquette, and responsibilities of monarchy. Marie Antoinette, just 14 at the time, had spent her childhood in Vienna, absorbing education in languages, music, dance, and courtly behavior, as well as lessons in diplomacy and observation. The pairing of these two young royals was intended to produce not only heirs, but also a visible symbol of reconciliation and alliance between two of Europe's most powerful states. Upon her arrival in France, the young Archduchess faced a rigorous process of acclimatization. She traveled through formal ceremonies, attended audiences with ministers, and was introduced to the complex hierarchy of Versailles. Every gesture, bow, and expression was subject to scrutiny. Even minor missteps could be magnified, interpreted as signs of incompetence, frivolity, or disrespect. The court's emphasis on ritualized behavior served not merely social purposes, but political ones, signaling adherence to hierarchy, loyalty to the crown, and proper understanding of one's role. For Marie Antoinette, the stakes were immense. Personal missteps could jeopardize both reputation and political influence. The wedding itself, though lavish, reflected the dual nature of the union. Personal intimacy was secondary to dynastic duty. Ceremonial displays, public appearances, and intricate rituals underscored the political and symbolic dimensions of the marriage. Observers within Versailles and in Paris noted every detail, from the grandeur of the dress to the seating arrangements to the formal exchanges between the families. Even the consummation of the marriage, though private, was framed as a matter of dynastic necessity. Producing heirs was the ultimate responsibility of both bride and groom. In the early years of marriage, Marie Antoinette's personal life was shaped by the intersection of intimacy, duty, and political symbolism. Her relationship with Louis Auguste was tentative and formal, reflecting youth, inexperience, and the weight of expectation. Shared activities, private conversations, and moments of personal connection were interspersed with the constant demands of ceremony and observation. Establishing trust, understanding temperament, and navigating emotional intimacy were challenging in the context of public scrutiny and personal pressure. Producing heirs was a central concern. The court, ministers, and public all focused on the need for children, especially a male heir, to secure the continuity of the monarchy. Delays or difficulties were often interpreted as evidence of incompetence or moral failing. For Marie Antoinette, the pressure to conceive was immense, both emotionally and physically. Advice from physicians, rituals designed to promote fertility, and even rumors circulated, highlighting the intensely personal stakes of a politically significant duty. The political dimension of the marriage extended beyond the production of heirs. Marie Antoinette's behavior, social presence, and management of her household were all scrutinized for evidence of wisdom, taste, and competence. Her choices in fashion, entertainment, and social gatherings were interpreted as indicators of political judgment or moral character. Even her private enjoyment of spaces like the Petit Trianon was viewed through a political lens, as courtiers and later public observers debated whether such retreats reflected personal refinement or indulgent detachment. Early interactions with court factions shaped the young queen's political understanding. Courtiers who aligned with ministers, influential families, or other members of the royal household observed her behavior closely. Alliances were formed subtly, and loyalty was constantly tested. Navigating these dynamics required strategic observation, discretion, and social intelligence, skills that Marie Antoinette began to cultivate in earnest. Each social engagement, compliment, or conversation carried implications that extended beyond personal pleasure, forming part of a broader negotiation of influence and authority. Health and physical well-being were intimately tied to marital and dynastic duties. Physicians monitored diet, activity, and menstrual cycles, reflecting both genuine concern and the broader societal pressures surrounding fertility. Illness, fatigue, or perceived failure could affect both personal life and public perception, underscoring the inseparability of private experience and political consequence. Marie Antoinette quickly recognized that managing her health was not only a personal concern, but also a political necessity. Despite these pressures, the young queen sought moments of personal connection and reflection. Time spent in private conversation with the king, walks in gardens, and informal gatherings allowed her to navigate the complex demands of marriage and public life. These moments provided a degree of emotional respite, allowing her to cultivate intimacy, practice social negotiation, and refine judgment in private before facing the relentless public eye. By the late 1772, it became clear that the success of the marriage would be judged not only by personal compatibility, but by the production of heirs, adherence to courtly expectation, and management of social perception. Every choice, from daily routines to public appearances, carried implications for both personal and political success. For Marie Antoinette, the intersection of private life, dynastic duty, and public scrutiny created a uniquely demanding environment, one that would shape her emotional resilience, social strategy, and emerging understanding of power. Yet even as she navigated these challenges, a persistent question remained. Could the young queen balance personal intimacy, dynastic responsibility, and public expectation without succumbing to the pressures that threatened both her private happiness and her emerging reputation? The answer would unfold slowly, shaped by the intricacies of court life, the demands of monarchy, and the often unpredictable outcomes of childbirth and political perception.